So this video is part of a series on Old Testament Textual Criticism, and in this video we're going to be dealing with the issue of intentional changes that were made to the text by scribes who were copying out the text of the Old Testament. And in this video we're going to be dealing with one particular type of change that could sometimes be made by scribes as they were copying out the text of the Old Testament. So the first type of intentional change that was sometimes made by scribes to the text of the Old Testament is changes that were made due to theological reasons. So maybe there was something in the text that the scribe felt a little bit uncomfortable with on a theological level, and they decided to change the text that they were copying out to match more closely with the type of theology they thought should have been expressed in the text that they were copying out. Now, when we hear the possibility that there might have been some of the Old Testament that was changed because the scribe was uncomfortable with the type of theology that was found in the text, that might make some people a little bit nervous. Exactly how much of the Old Testament was changed by scribes because they were uncomfortable with the theology that was found in the text? Well, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind as we're taking a look at this type of intentional change that was made to the text. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is that this type of intentional change would have been extremely rare. And the reason why we know that this type of change would have been extremely rare is because there are all kinds of passages in the text of the Old Testament that scribes would have been uncomfortable with from a theological perspective, but they left these texts unchanged. For the most part, the scribes that were copying out the text of the Old Testament were extremely careful to reproduce exactly what they had in the manuscript that they were copying out before them. The second thing that we need to keep in mind is that these type of changes, for the most part, would have been made at a very late date in terms of the textual transmission of the text of the Old Testament. And in the case of the example that we're going to be taking a look at in this video, we're going to see that because this change was made at a relatively late date, the original reading, or at least something that would have been close to the original reading, is preserved in at least some of the witnesses that we have to the text of that particular book of the Bible. So the example that we're going to be using for this type of intentional textual change is found in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8. And this is a classic example that is used by textual critics to illustrate a change that was made to the text due to theological reasons. Let's take a look at what the text has to say in Firkovitch B19a, also known as Codex Leningradensis, and this represents the reading that you would find in the Masoretic Tradition of the Hebrew Bible. Let's take a look at what it says. It says, Yatsev Gevuloth Amim Lemispar B'nei Yisrael. And he established the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, for most people, this wouldn't really be a passage that they would pay a lot of attention to. But this passage is extremely significant from a text critical point of view because this passage was intentionally changed by scribes because they did not like the theology that they found in the text that they were copying. So how exactly do we know that an intentional change was made to the text of Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8? Well, one piece of evidence that we can use is the reading that we find in the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8. Well, let's take a look at what the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 says in the vast majority of manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint. It says, Estesen horia ethnon kata arithman Engelon Theu, and he established the borders of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. So notice the difference that we have between the Septuagint's reading of Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 and what we find in the Masoretic tradition of Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8. In the Septuagint, at least in the vast majority of manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint, it says, according to the number of the angels of God. However, in the Masoretic tradition it says, according to the number of the sons of Israel. And as good textual critics, we need to ask the question, why are these readings so different from each other? So some people might be tempted to simply avoid the issue because the entire Masoretic tradition agrees with the reading that we have in Firkovitch B19a, according to the number of the sons of Israel. And not only does the Masoretic tradition completely agree when it comes to the reading of Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, it's also the reading that's found in two important witnesses to the text of the Old Testament, the Syriac Peshitta and the Latin Vulgate. So in the Syriac Peshitta it reads, Akim tehum de ame lemenyana Davnai Israel. He established the boundary of the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. That's the exact same reading that we saw in Firkovitch B19a. In the Latin Vulgate, it says, Constituit terminos populorum juxta numerum filiorum Israel. He established the borders of the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. Again, that's the exact same reading that we saw in Firkovitch B19a. We have to remember, however, that the Syriac Peshitta and the Latin Vulgate are both dependent on the Masoretic tradition of the Hebrew text. And that means in this case, this does not count as evidence in favor of the reading that we have in Firkovitch B19a, because we would expect these two witnesses to match up with the reading that we have in Firkovitch B19a. So we still need to answer the question, why is the reading that we have for Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8 in the Masoretic tradition so different from the reading that we have in the vast majority of manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint? Well, thankfully, there is another piece of evidence that we can look to help explain why these two readings are so different. And this evidence is a fragment that we have of the book of Deuteronomy that was found at Qumran. It is 4Q Deuteronomy J. And this is how it reads in Hebrew. It says, Yatsev Guvuloth Amim Lemispar B'nei Elohim. And he established the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, at first, that might seem to be a little bit problematic because now we have a third reading that is added to the mix. So remember, in the Masoretic tradition, it says, according to the number of the sons of Israel. And in the Septuagint, in the vast majority of manuscripts, it says, according to the number of the angels. Well, now we have a third reading, according to the number of the sons of God. In this case, however, rather than making the waters murkier, this actually helps us to explain why the Septuagint reading and the reading that we have in the Masoretic tradition are so different from each other. So how does the reading that we have in 4Q Deuteronomy J help us to understand why the reading that we have in the Masoretic tradition is so different from the reading that we have in the vast majority of manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint? Well, the reason has to do with how that term B'nai Elohim, sons of God, would have been understood in Hebrew and in its ancient Near Eastern context. That term B'nai Elohim in Hebrew is most naturally understood to mean those who belong to the Elohim class, or those who belong to the God class, or you could simply translate it as divine beings, or you could translate it as gods. Now, you can understand why that would create such a theological problem for a scribe who was copying out this text. They would probably hear it as saying something like this, and he established the borders of the peoples according to the number of the gods. And for a monotheistic religion like Judaism, obviously that poses a big problem. So how do we know that that term B'nai Elohim would have been most naturally understood in Hebrew to mean those belonging to the Elohim class, or those belonging to the God class, divine beings, or simply gods? How do we know that B'nai Elohim would have been understood in that way? Well, there are basically two reasons why we know that. The first reason has to do with how the word Bain is used in Hebrew, in phrases like Bain Adam, which means son of man, a person belonging to the human class, and there are other uses as well that can illustrate that. But another way that we know that that would be the most natural way to understand that term B'nai Elohim has to do with how that exact same term is used in cognate languages to Hebrew. So in Ugaritic, we have the exact same term, sons of God, being used to refer to the gods or divine beings. We have another example here in Azitawada's Phoenician Luwian inscription, and Phoenician is a language that is almost identical to Biblical Hebrew, and this is what it says. It says, "May Baal of the heavens and El, the creator of the earth, the eternal Son, and all the generation of the sons of the gods eradicate that kingdom." Now that term, B'nai Elim in this case, is basically identical with the term that we saw in 4Q Deuteronomy J, B'nai Elohim. And in this context, it is very clear that the sons of God are those who belong to the God class, or divine beings, those who would have been considered to be gods by Azitawada and those who would have been reading this inscription. So what's the best explanation that can explain the existence of each of these three readings? Well, the best explanation is that the original reading for Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8 is the one that's found in 4Q Deuteronomy J, the fragment that was discovered at Qumran, the one that reads B'nai Elohim. And the scribes who produced the readings that are found in the Masoretic Tradition and in the vast majority of manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint changed the text that they were copying for theological reasons. Because as good monotheists, they did not want to leave the impression that there are more gods that exist than the God of Israel. So the scribe who produced the reading that we have in the Masoretic Tradition changed B'nai Elohim to B'nai Yisrael, changed it from sons of God to sons of Israel, and completely changed the meaning of the text. Now the scribe who produced the reading that we have in the vast majority of manuscripts for the Septuagint did a lot better. They changed B'nai Elohim, sons of God, to angels of God. Now the reason why that's a better reading and doesn't fundamentally change the meaning of the text is that later on in Old Testament theology, the B'nai Elohim are understood to be identical with the angels of God. So in this case, the scribe that produced this reading is not changing the meaning of the text fundamentally, but is simply clarifying what these beings actually are. These beings aren't God in the same sense that the God of Israel is God, but they are the angels of God. Now what's interesting is that we actually have confirmation for this explanation because there are two manuscripts of the Septuagint manuscript 848 and 106c, that actually read Huion Theu, the sons of God. So it's possible that the vast majority of manuscripts that we have that read the angels of God were actually copying from a Greek text that in turn was copied from a Hebrew text that read sons of God. Now before we start panicking, and before we start to think that there might have been all kinds of changes that were made to the text of the Old Testament by scribes who might have had a theological problem with some of the things that they saw in the text, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is that the change that we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8 happened at a relatively late date in the history of the transmission of the text of the Old Testament. We have two manuscripts of the Septuagint that read sons of God, and we also have a manuscript from Qumran as well, 4Q Deuteronomy J, that has the exact same reading. But up until that point, the text of Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 would have been transmitted faithfully reading sons of God, even though there might have been a theological problem in that text. The second thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are a number of other passages in the Old Testament that have the exact same theological problem. But in the case of those texts, scribes did not change the text. And that lets us know that for the most part, these texts were transmitted faithfully by Hebrew scribes with no theological changes being made to the text whatsoever. Let's take a look at a couple of different examples. So the first example is found in Psalm 29 and verse 1, and this is what it says. Mizmor leDavid, havu ladonai b'nei elim, havu ladonai kavod wa'oz. A psalm of David, ascribe to the Lord, O sons of gods, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. So in this case, we have the exact same theological problem that we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8, but the text has remained unchanged. The second example that we have is found in Job chapter 1 and verse 6, and this is what it says. Vayhi hayom vayavo'u b'nei ha'elohim lohithyatsev al Adonai, vayavo ram hasatan b'thocham. And it came about on a certain day that the sons of God presented themselves to the Lord, and the accuser also came among them. So again, we have another example where we have the exact same theological problem that we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8, but the scribes left these texts unchanged. They left these texts unchanged, which lets us know that for the most part, these scribes were faithful in transmitting the text of the Old Testament, even when there might have been a text that would have posed a theological problem for them. So that's the first type of intentional change that could sometimes be made by scribes as they were copying out the text of the Old Testament. Intentional changes that were made due to theological reasons. Now, of course, we have to remember that this type of change, in all likelihood, would have been very rare, and we can see that by the fact that there are a number of theologically problematic texts in the Old Testament that were never changed by scribes. And the second thing that we need to remember is that in the case of Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8, that this change happened at a relatively late date in the history of the transmission of the text of the Old Testament. To put this in perspective, this probably would have changed or happened after the time of Jesus. And that means that up until that point, the text of Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8 would have been transmitted faithfully despite the theological problems that are found in the text. So that's the first type of intentional change that could sometimes be made by scribes copying out the text of the Old Testament. Thanks for watching.